Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me today. It's my pleasure to be here and to share with you our story and experience of trying to conserve cultural heritage landscapes in Mississauga. I'm calling it a mixed blessing in the title because it really is. There's been the good, the bad, and the ugly, which I will tell you more about as we go along in this presentation. The image that's here on the very front of my presentation is our civic square, which we have identified as a cultural landscape important to the downtown core of Mississauga. To give you some background, in the late 1990s, we started to look at what we identified as an issue, and that trying to protect individual properties really wasn't enough. It wasn't really cutting it. We wanted to look at collections of properties, areas, character areas, but at the time that was somewhat of a new concept. And the legislation, of course, only had individual properties and HCDs, and we wanted to look at something that was in between those two. So we started looking and finding some research, and we came across this whole concept of cultural landscapes, which we were thinking and going in that direction, but we didn't even know that at the time because it was a fairly new concept within this area anyway. So one of the first things we did was we put together a steering committee made up of city staff, heritage planning staff, planning department, policy, and also some members of our heritage advisory committee. And then we hired a consulting team as well. So we put that together. We came up with a total of 65 sites that we identified within the city, and that was a combination of sites that staff recommended and sites that the consultants recommended. It was difficult at the time because we didn't have things like Parks Canada standards and guidelines or the Untitled Heritage Trust list or the toolkit. All of those things did not exist, so we were kind of on our own in going through this process. There were some European examples, not much in North America that we could find anyway, and so we found it a real challenge, and trying to put that list together and to bring it forward as a report and identify a true inventory was about a 2.5-year period to do that. In 2004, we took our list of what we identified as cultural heritage landscapes to council and had that adopted as an inventory. And then with the changes in the Act in 2005, we then converted that list into the city's heritage register. So the register then is made up of course, our designated properties as well as all listed properties. So when that happened, adding those 65 cultural landscapes, we then all of a sudden went from about 250 listed properties to over 3,000, because some of those cultural landscapes are very vast, and I'll show you examples of them. Probably the one I'll talk about more in a moment is the Credit River, which runs through all of Mississauga from the north to the south. And there alone, there's over 1,000 properties in that one cultural landscape. So all of a sudden, we are having a major impact on property owners, and although we went through a public process and made it as known as we could and held public meetings, there are people still today who go, "What do you mean my property's listed?" The definition, this is the definition that we used at the time, and we have not altered or changed it, although we totally recognize that we need to, because again, this has been over 10 years and we need to update the whole thing, which again, I'll talk about more in a moment. But that's the definitions that we've been using, identifying cultural heritage landscapes and then cultural features within those landscapes. We came up with a typology, talking about agricultural landscapes, historic settlements, industrial, institutional, natural, parks and other urban spaces, and then residential. And I've got some examples to show you. A natural landscape is the Credit River. And of course the Credit River runs through all, as I mentioned, all of Mississauga. It's certainly first recognized as for its Aboriginal and Indigenous importance. And that's the way I tend to think of it more than its development over the last 200 years. But there obviously has been a lot of development along the Credit River over 200 years. And as I mentioned before, there are a lot of property owners, anywhere from residential to institutional to industrial along that entire river corridor, as well as the City Conservation Authority. So many people to deal with whenever we're dealing with a listing on that credit river. Another example of parks and urban space is the Port Credit Harbor. On the right-hand side of this photograph, you can see the harbor and the yacht club, the downtown core, if you want to call it that, of Port Credit, the commercial core of Port Credit, which you can see is quite dense and becoming more dense day by day. On the left-hand side of the river, that's the Credit River going up through there. On the left-hand side of the Credit River, south of Lakeshore, is a heritage conservation district known as Old Port Credit. So it includes that side of the harbor. We are just starting the process of, that plan was done in 2004. So we are starting the process in 2017 of completely revisiting that HCD plan and redoing that plan, updating that plan. And part of that will be also looking at the boundaries of the HCD, and we're thinking at the moment of including the east side of the harbor as well as just the west side, so that we have that whole mouth of the river included. Agricultural landscape. We don't have much agricultural land left in Mississauga. At one time it was, and not that long ago, a lot of agricultural land, but now there's very little left. This is known as the Britannia Farm. It's on Huron, Ontario, just south of the 401, below Britannia Avenue Road. And it is lands owned by the school board, the public school board of Peel County. It's almost 200 acres, which has been in the school board ownership since I think something like 1820. And so there's very little development. The school board has their head office on that property, but the rest of it is pretty much traditionally has been farmland. There are 3 or 4 heritage buildings on the property, and they are just beginning the process of a new master plan for how they want to see all of those lands developed in the future, which includes some of the actual development, as in new buildings and density, but it also includes quite a bit of retaining the natural elements of that property. Industrial. There was quite a bit of industrial along the waterfront of Mississauga. This is in Clarkson, Suncor Industry. And it's one of the few left, actually, and it's really quite a landmark, both from the land and the water. So that's why we pointed this particular one out. But we do have a number of them. And some have actually completely disappeared. We identified the Lakeview generating plant as a cultural heritage landscape. And as you may know, it is no longer there. It's completely gone and wiped out. There's no physical evidence left.
Is this structure listed?
Yes, it is listed.
Good.
So all of these are listed. Historic settlements are the core of Streetsville, which is a typical small town Ontario sort of streetscape. We also have cultural features that are particular features within cultural landscapes. So some examples, this is a water tower from our small arms factory in the Lakeview area. Some natural features, this is a particular stone outcropping on the Credit River. A bridge over the Credit River in Port Credit. A golf course called Lakeview Golf Course. It's over 100 years old, and it is fully designated as a cultural landscape. So this is the only one I think we've actually taken to that next level of providing full designation under Part 4 of the Act. This is it's called Karia Park, which the City of Mississauga is twinned with Karia, Japan. And so we have a Japanese garden and center in the middle of Mississauga. Example of residential, this is the Adamson Estate on the waterfront, which was the home of Anthony Adamson. Wartime housing area in Malton, and this is an example of one of the remaining homes of that wartime housing area. Sort of bring things up to date. The intent was always to keep our inventory as a very much alive document and update it and change it. However, that really hasn't happened just due to staff resources. And so we know we've got a lot more to do. We have large residential areas that have a major impact because they are a very high property value. There's constant turnover in those areas of houses being demolished. Because of that, we average at minimum 3 heritage impact assessments per month that go to our Heritage Advisory Committee on demolition of those buildings within those landscapes. At least 50% of our heritage permits are on those types of demolitions. So staff spend a good deal of their time strictly dealing with just this issue, which does not leave us time to do all the other things we want to do, like actual designations of properties or other studies and policy work. We're actually considering and taking a report to our next Heritage Advisory Committee of putting a suspension on all residential areas as cultural landscapes because we just can't keep up with the workload anymore. And we do have funding, which we've been asking for years, and we finally got it from Council, that in 2018 we will be doing a full review of our cultural landscape inventory and study and completely revamping that. And hopefully Toronto will have already done theirs by the time we get around to that, and we can use you as a good example. Make our process much smoother.
It's a horse race.
Yeah. That would be very helpful, Mary, if you could get that done in time for us to do our study. So has it made a difference? Yes and no. So we've been at this over 10 years now, and yes, it has made an impact in that you can probably ask most of our councillors, I say most, maybe not all, but most of our councillors and our senior staff, and certainly the development community within Mississauga, and they will know what a cultural landscape is, because they've been dealing with it for a long time. So that is very positive, and there is that awareness there. I'd say no, it hasn't worked in that out of all of the properties that we've put through the process, and we have hundreds of heritage impact assessments done on those properties, yes, we have a great record, but we don't have any of those structures left. They've all been demolished, they're all gone. The landscape is there, but the actual structure isn't. And most of those are of a residential nature. We have only had one that has actually gone through the process that we have recommended to Council to be actually designated. It was a residential property on the Credit River that backed onto the Credit River. It was a stereotype, excellent example of 1960s executive home architecture. It's a beautiful home, incredible detail. And it should have been designated, but Council did not agree. And so that property was not protected, unfortunately.
Is it gone?
Sorry?
Has it gone? Demolished?
No, actually it did sell, and the new owners have not, to my knowledge, really modified it much. So I think with the new, since we have a new council, we might try that one again and go back and revisit that, because it really is quite worthy of designation. So as I mentioned, it is time for us to review our whole process and what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we're about to begin that. Hopefully the suspension over the next 2 years will give us, our staff, time to pull all of that together. We've got a lot of other work that we have to do, so by 2018 we're going to be going into this full force and trying to solve a lot of problems that we've had. And I can't begin to tell you all of those at the moment, but if anyone wants to get in touch with me, then you're more than happy to do so, and I'd be glad to talk to anybody about that. Thank you.